there's a particular case at the moment involving a prominent Maori leader. I often wonder in those cases if they actually got their tactics from the Soviet Union. If I say it didn't happen for long enough, maybe I'll convince people that it didn't. And I've actually been watching some of that at the moment to do with the Manurewa Marae issue, because John Tamihere, the leader of the Waipareira Trust and also the president of the Te Pāti Māori, is in actual fact taking that particular view. This didn't happen. And eventually, if you tell a lie long enough, loud enough, there will be always people who actually believe you. So it doesn't matter that it's a complete falsehood, that it's a complete false narrative. If I keep on repeating it, and I can repeat it sincerely with passion and a bit of spark and spirit in my voice, there'll be people who will be convinced. And I'll give you an example of the latter, and that is that Te Ao Māori News, which I think is funded 100% by the New Zealand taxpayer and sort of a derivative of Radio New Zealand, I think that's what its origins were, Te Ao Māori News, has decided that Te Pāti, and is now reporting, as of yesterday and still of today, that Te Pāti Māori and the Manurewa Marae have now been cleared of any wrongdoing. So I'll repeat that. Te Pāti Marae and Te Pāti Māori and the Manurewa Marae have now been cleared of any wrongdoing. And they are reporting that under a headline, "It was a witch hunt, Tamihere on the Manurewa Marae inquiry." Now, which is John Tamihere, the Te Pāti Māori Marae president, essentially denying that a whole series of facts happened. And really, I have to say, when you ask Maori folk if that really did occur, if there was some breach of integrity, if there was some wrongdoing to do with this, well, if they were listening to Te Ao Māori News and they were listening to John Tamihere, they would be convinced that not only had both individuals, Marae and Party, in actual fact, been cleared of any wrongdoing by the Roach and Craig reports that were released earlier this week, but also that it had been a setup to have a go at a party that was legitimately representing Maori interests, and because they were deliberately targeted by the agencies of the state to kneecap Maori aspirations, as Maori aspirations have been kneecapped by Pākehā and Pākehā agencies ever since 1840. So it runs into that complete narrative, you see. Now, I have very little doubt that the Manurewa Marae scandal, and we'll put it in scandal yet because we haven't quite got to the end of that. In fact, we haven't. There are still 3 separate police investigations occurring. The police are still investigating, the Privacy Commissioner, and the Serious Fraud Office. Okay. So they're still investigating. There's been no clearance, and certainly you'd have to argue that the 2 reports that have been published this week suggest skullduggery on an almost industrial basis. But, and that's ipso facto, why 3 other agencies of the state, including the police, are now investigating for potential criminal wrongdoing. All right, so the scandal, if you like, hasn't been confirmed in the sense that no one's done anything criminally wrong yet, nor been charged. But if you listen to Te Ao Māori, no, those reports did actually, Te Ao Māori News, did clear Te Pāti Māori, and there's nothing to see here other than more wanton discrimination. But then there is the other side of this, which is why Bryce Edwards from the Integrity, a research fellow from the School of Government at Victoria University, heading what was the Democracy Project, it's now called the integrity something, Bryce will tell us what it is suggesting that in actual fact, the scandal, it is already. And what he's really suggesting, and why we will be interviewing him later on this morning, in fact later on this hour, is this. The scandal is that 6 government departments actually decided that when it came to dealing with the Manurewa Marae and with the Waiparewa Trust, they would suspend the rules. Now, why did they do that? Now, Bryce Edwards got a particular view about that. He just says, well, the true reason is because they didn't do their job, and that this is a sort of lax attitude that comes from government agencies in dealing with providers, whether they're health providers, whether it's the stats department, whether it's Oranga Tamariki, they've got lax rules in place. Can I suggest to you this morning that that isn't true, and that is not, in actual fact, the proper interpretation. And neither is it true that John Tamihere and his mob have been unfairly singled out because they're Maori. I'm going to suggest to you an entirely different narrative that's at play here. And I'm going to suggest, and I guess I have the relatively unique perspective of having, in actual fact, been in Parliament in the late 1980s when all this started. And then having sat for 6 years on the Maori Affairs Select Committee at Parliament from 1990 to 1996. It's a relatively unique perspective because there is nothing in 2025, I would argue, in this report or reports that have been released this week, they're not any different than how government departments treated Maori health and employment providers in the 1980s. This isn't a new scandal. This isn't something that's just arisen. This has been in place since 1985, not 2025. This has been going on for 40 years, in my experience. And it runs this way. And let's be bloody honest about it, shall we? If it's Maori, the rules don't apply. That is the overwhelming philosophy and ideology that runs the public sector in this country, and it has for 40 years. There is nothing that Health New Zealand or Te Whātau Ora, as it was then known, Te Puni Kokori, Oranga Tamariki, Statistics New Zealand, the Ministry of Social Development, any of those agencies that were involved in this investigation haven't been doing for 40 years. Not 4 months, not 4 years, 40. And again, how do I know this? Because I was the researcher in 1985-86 who uncovered the corruption of 2 schemes that many of you won't remember. But one of them was called the Mana Employment Scheme, and the other one was called the Maori Access Scheme, 40 years ago, which were run at that time under a Labour government under a policy called devolution. The idea that Maori should take responsibility for themselves. It was quite a radical idea in 1984-85 when it was implemented by the Longi Palmer government. The idea that Maori don't need state assistance, they can do it for themselves. Now, it's a lovely concept, can I say, and the plight of Maori 40 years ago was nowhere near as bad as it is now. In fact, you might argue that Maori 40 years ago were much better off as an ethnicity and a culture than they are now, if you looked at all the statistics, and things have got worse over the last 40 years, not better. But 40 years ago, the Labour government of that time said, with very strong backing from the Maori caucus. If you give us the resources, we will do a better job than the state can do at making sure we improve all those really bad stats, you know, the education stats, the crime stats, the health stats. Give them the welfare dependent stats, give them to us, and we will look after them. And so the first two programs that they wheeled out as part of that were Mana, which was a large sum of money, I'll come to that in just a second, and Maori Access. Now, the Access training program was basically, in those days, a generic program across New Zealand in which people who are unemployed could learn new skills because all the traditional industries were falling over at the time, and the idea was that Access would be a bridgeway for not just those leaving school, but also from adults as well, to learn new skills for the new economy. Yeah, you can see how that worked out. And so they set up a particular one, Maori Access, to say, well, we'll just pull the Maori stuff out and we'll give them a separate tranche of funding for there. Mana was a different program. If you give money to Maori, they will create economic and entrepreneurial objectives that will actually provide employment. So that was a different program. And they were run, though, sort of side by side out of Te Puni Kokori and out of the Department of Employment, as it was at that time. I think it was, what was it called? I think it was Employment New Zealand, or New Zealand Employment. Out of Trade and Industry. There were a whole series of other government departments that did it. And they also did it for health. Listen, if you guys look after health on the marae, Maori health will improve. 40 years ago. What happened? I'll tell you what happened. A whole series of corrupt actions happened where providers simply hoovered up the money for themselves, rewarded their friends, created no jobs, lied about what they were doing and how many jobs were created, which was then lies that were repeated in Parliament, and no one got any better and trained, employed, healthier. A very few took a large sum of government money and gave it to themselves and to their mates. And there was nepotism on a grand scale. That was the results of Mana and Maori Access 40 years ago, and it made Winston Peters' career because he was the one on a regular basis unveiling scandal after scandal, corruption after corruption on these programs. Yes, but how did they occur? Well, eventually, Winston, I worked for him then as his researcher. I was the one uncovering the scandals and writing his press releases and his speeches and feeding him, and he did a magnificent job of politically conveying that. He ended up, getting so much press conference and press coverage at the time, he ended up as the preferred Prime Minister in all of the polling agencies, including Television New Zealand at the time, which was rather embarrassing then for the leader of the opposition, Jim Bolger, because he was trailing his Maori MP from Tauranga by about 20 percentage points when it came to who should be the next Prime Minister of New Zealand. Anyhow, another story. Yes, but wait on. Where was the real problem? The real problem actually wasn't in giving Maori leaders money and then saying, off you go. The real problem was that government departments knew that there was no accountability mechanism in place, knew that they couldn't actually contractually bind where that money was going, so ran the high trust model. 40 years later, we're doing exactly the same thing in the Pania Gray Michael Heron report being acknowledged now, that came out this week. And it's been run for 40 years. When we finally, in select committees, put those particular government officials in front of us, including from Treasury, do you know what they all actually said to us? The rules don't apply to Maori. Sorry? Well, yes, we do have those accountability mechanisms in place. Yes, with all other providers, we do that. Yes, we do audit them. Yes, we check that they're working. But we don't do them for Māori. Why? Because the rules don't apply for Māori. They've got their own way with the white bureaucrats saying to us of doing things. And that way apparently includes corruption, not accounting for government money, and trying to resist audit. And when you do go in there and have a look at it, you get accused of racism anyhow. That was 40 years ago, and 40 years later, here we are in exactly the same place. The real problem that we've got in this country, and this is the real racism, is we've got white bureaucrats in this country who not just now, but for the last 40 years have been saying the same thing. Māori people are different. They're so different that we treat them differently. When we give them government money, we won't hold them to the same standards as any non-Māori who receive that, particularly Pākehā providers, because they're different. And all that does is engender corruption. All that does is make sure that the John Tamiheres of this world see you coming. Very smart man, John Tamihere and his ilk. And they know that they can involve themselves with trenches, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of money for whatever the Māori cause might be, and that there will be no proper procedure for accounting how that money has been spent. In a funny sort of way, John Tamihere's right. He is being singled out. Māori are being treated differently, but not in the way that he suggests. And the worst part of that is, and it's the same analogy that Winston Peters, and I didn't write this for him, came up with it himself. He used to say, if you treat Māori as if they are simpletons, if you treat them as if they can't actually reach the same accountability standards as others, if you treat them as if they're not smart enough to be able to work things out, they will reach your expectation. In other words, his argument was, you treat Māori like everybody else and you will get the same accountability and responsibility. You treat them differently and you deserve everything coming your way. And I would suggest to you that that is the real lesson of the two reports that were dropped this week. One by Doug Craig, the other written by Michael Heron, Casey and Panya Gray, into the events of Manurewa Marae, Te Pāti Māori, the Waiparira Trust and the like. The real problem here is that public servants do not hold, and have never held for the last 40 years, the same standards to apply to Māori providers as they do to non-Māori providers in the country. They treat them with kids' gloves, and they do that because they think this is their cultural response. They are the ones that encourage integrity issues. They are the ones that create the conditions for corruption. And why should we be surprised that therefore John Tamihere can say, you're treating me different? We sure are, mate, and we have been for the last 40 years. And can I ask also a simple question? Are our stats when they come to education, crime, employment and health any better over the last 40 years for having adopted these policies? Have Māori risen in proportion to other ethnicities and cultures in the New Zealand population? They have not. And we've spent hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to get to the same outcome that we discovered was all wrong and not working in 1985, not 2025. Those are my thoughts this morning. What are yours?